When James, a compassionate cop, discovers a terrified black boy named Marcus living alone in an abandoned park, he's deeply shaken. But when he uncovers the heartbreaking reason behind the boy's isolation, it shatters everything he thought he knew. What devastating truth could drive a child to such desperate circumstances? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer James Carter sat in his patrol car, staring blankly at the quiet streets of Millbrook. The small town was as peaceful as ever, but inside, James felt anything but calm. His heart ached with a pain that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. It had been 3 months since Mila, his beloved wife of 10 years, had passed away. The loss left a gaping hole in his life, one that he couldn't seem to fill no matter how hard he tried. James rubbed his tired eyes, feeling the weight of sleepless nights. He hadn't been able to rest properly since Mila's death. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, heard her laugh, and felt the warmth of her touch. It was both a comfort and a torment. As he drove slowly through the familiar streets, James's mind wandered to happier times. He remembered the day he and Mila had moved to Millbrook, full of hope and dreams for their future together. They had fallen in love with the charming town, its friendly people, and the sense of community it offered. Now that same town felt hollow without Mila by his side. The cheery greetings from passers-by only served to remind James of his loss. He nodded politely in response, but his smile never quite reached his eyes. At the station, his colleagues treated him with kid gloves, their concerned glances following him as he went about his duties. James appreciated their kindness, but it also made him feel more isolated. No one seemed to know quite what to say to him anymore. As James parked his car in front of the police station, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for another day of pretending everything was okay. He stepped out of the vehicle, his uniform crisp and neat as always, but his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. Inside the station, the familiar bustle of activity surrounded him. Officers chatted, phones rang, and the smell of strong coffee filled the air. It was all so normal, so unchanged, while James felt like his whole world had been turned upside down. He made his way to his desk, nodding hello to his fellow officers. As he sat down, his eyes fell on the framed photo of Mila that still sat on his desk. Her bright smile beamed back at him, and James felt a lump form in his throat. "I miss you so much," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He traced her face with his finger, wishing he could reach through the glass and touch her one more time. The sound of someone clearing their throat nearby startled James out of his reverie. He looked up to see his partner, Officer Nora Thompson, standing by his desk with a sympathetic look on her face. "Hey, James," she said softly. "How are you holding up?" James forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm okay, Nora. Thanks for asking." Nora nodded, clearly not believing him but choosing not to push. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me." As she walked away, James turned back to his desk, his heart heavy. He knew he needed to find a way to move forward, to honor Mila's memory by living the life she would have wanted for him. But right now, in this moment, all he could feel was the overwhelming grief that threatened to consume him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Millbrook's quiet streets, Officer James Carter found himself on another routine patrol. The familiar sights of the town blurred past his window, barely registering in his grief-fogged mind. He was about to turn onto Main Street when something caught his eye. In the distance, a faint flickering light danced in the darkness of the old abandoned park. James frowned, his police instincts kicking in despite his emotional exhaustion. That park had been empty for months, ever since the town's budget cuts had forced its closure. James pulled his patrol car to the curb and stepped out, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. The cool evening air nipped at his face as he made his way towards the park's rusty gates. With each step, the flickering light grew more distinct. As he entered the park, James's eyes adjusted to the gloom. The once cheerful playground now stood silent and eerie, swings creaking gently in the breeze. He followed the light, weaving through overgrown bushes and around abandoned picnic tables. Finally, James reached the source of the light. Hidden behind a cluster of trees was a small, makeshift shelter cobbled together from cardboard boxes, old tarps, and branches. A tiny lantern flickered inside, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the crude structure. James's heart clenched. Someone was living here in these harsh conditions. He took a cautious step forward, leaves crunching under his feet. Suddenly, a small figure burst from the shelter, nearly colliding with James in its haste to escape. James's eyes widened as he caught sight of a young boy, no more than 12 years old, with wild eyes and disheveled hair. "Wait!" James called out, but the boy was already sprinting away, weaving through the trees with the agility of someone who knew the terrain well. Without thinking, James gave chase. His longer legs allowed him to gain ground, but the boy was quick and nimble. They darted through the park, past rusted playground equipment and overgrown flower beds. "I'm not going to hurt you," James shouted, his breath coming in short gasps. "Please, I just want to help." The boy glanced back, fear evident in his wide eyes. In that split second of distraction, his foot caught on a root, and he tumbled to the ground with a yelp. James slowed his pace, approaching the boy carefully. The child scrambled backward, pressing himself against a tree trunk, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. "It's okay," James said softly, crouching down to appear less threatening. "I'm a police officer. My name is James. Can you tell me yours?" The boy remained silent, eyeing James warily. In the dim light, James could see the dirt smudged on the child's face and the way his clothes hung loosely on his thin frame. "Marcus," the boy finally whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. James felt a mix of relief and concern wash over him. "Marcus," he repeated gently, "what are you doing out here all alone?" Marcus hugged his knees to his chest, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. I can't go back," he mumbled. James's brow furrowed with worry. "Can't go back where, Marcus? Where are your parents?" At the mention of parents, Marcus flinched visibly. James's heart sank, recognizing the signs of a child in distress. His police training kicked in, but so did something else, a protective instinct he hadn't felt in a long time. "It's not safe for you to stay here," James said softly. "Will you let me help you?" Marcus hesitated, his eyes searching James's face for any sign of deceit. James waited patiently, his hand outstretched, offering not just help, but a lifeline to this scared, lonely boy. James slowly extended his hand towards Marcus, his eyes filled with compassion. "Come on, son. Let's get you somewhere warm and safe." Marcus hesitated, his body trembling slightly. After a moment, he tentatively reached out and took James's hand. The officer helped the boy to his feet, noticing how light and frail he felt. "Are you hungry?" James asked gently. Marcus nodded, his eyes downcast. "All right, I've got some snacks in my car. Let's head there and we can figure out what to do next." As they walked back through the abandoned park, James kept a protective hand on Marcus's shoulder. The boy flinched at first, but gradually relaxed under the officer's touch. At the patrol car, James retrieved a granola bar and a bottle of water from the glove compartment. Marcus devoured the food quickly, his eyes darting around as if afraid someone might take it away. "Easy there," James said softly. "No one's going to take it from you. I've got more if you're still hungry." Marcus paused, looking up at James with a mix of suspicion and hope. "Really?" James nodded, his heart aching for the boy. "Really. Now, let's get you to the station where it's warm. We'll figure out how to help you there." At the police station, James settled Marcus in his office, wrapping him in a warm blanket and providing more snacks. The boy remained guarded but seemed to relax slightly in the safety of the small room. James picked up his phone, dialing social services. After several rings, a tired voice answered. "This is Officer Carter. I've got a young boy here who needs immediate assistance." The social worker on the other end sighed heavily. "I'm sorry, officer, but we're completely swamped. Budget cuts have left us understaffed, and we're dealing with a backlog of cases." James frowned, glancing at Marcus, who was huddled in the chair, looking small and vulnerable. "This is urgent. He's been living in the park, for goodness sake." "I understand, but there's simply no one available right now. The earliest we could send someone is next week." James ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. "Next week? This boy needs help now." "I'm sorry, officer. That's the best we can do. In the meantime, you'll have to follow standard procedure." As James hung up the phone, he looked out the window at the quiet streets of Millbrook. People were going about their evening routines, unaware of the young boy's plight just a few blocks away. The disconnect between the community and those suffering within it struck James hard. He turned back to Marcus, who was watching him with wary eyes. "Looks like we might be stuck together for a little while, kiddo," James said, trying to sound cheerful. "How about we find you a more comfortable place to sleep tonight?" James looked at Marcus, his heart heavy with concern. He couldn't bear the thought of sending the boy back to the streets. With a deep breath, he made a decision. "Marcus, how would you feel about staying with me for a little while?" James asked gently. The boy's eyes widened, a mix of hope and fear flickering across his face. "Really? You'd do that?" James nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Really? It's not ideal, but it's better than you being out there alone." Marcus hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. "Okay," he whispered. James's apartment was small and sparsely furnished, but it was warm and safe. He set Marcus up on the couch with blankets and pillows, making sure the boy was comfortable. "Now let's eat a proper meal, shall we?" James asked. Marcus nodded shyly. As James heated up some canned soup, he watched Marcus from the corner of his eye. The boy sat stiffly on the couch, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for hidden dangers. They ate in silence, Marcus wolfing down the soup like he hadn't eaten in days, which, James realized with a pang, might well be true. After dinner, James noticed a dusty chess set on a shelf. "Do you play?" he asked, gesturing towards it. Marcus's eyes lit up for the first time since James had met him. "Sometimes," he said softly. "My mom taught me." James's heart ached at the mention of Marcus's mother, but he pushed the feeling aside. "Want to play a game?" As they set up the board, James noticed Marcus's hands were steadier, his movements more relaxed. The boy's brow furrowed in concentration as he considered his moves, reminding James of his own childhood passion for the game. To James's surprise, Marcus was a skilled player. The boy's clever strategies and thoughtful moves impressed him, and for a while they both forgot about their troubles, lost in the world of kings and queens, knights and pawns. As the game progressed, James noticed a small smile playing on Marcus's lips. It was the first time he'd seen the boy look anything close to happy. "Checkmate," Marcus said quietly, his eyes darting up to James's face as if afraid of his reaction. James grinned, genuinely delighted. "Well played. You're quite the chess master, Marcus." A hint of pride crossed Marcus's face, quickly replaced by a guarded expression. But James had seen it, a glimpse of the boy beneath the fear and mistrust. "How about another game?" James suggested. Marcus nodded eagerly, already resetting the board. As they played, James felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A small connection, a shared moment of joy in the midst of their difficult circumstances. For the first time since losing his wife, James felt a spark of purpose. He might not be able to fix everything, but he could be there for this boy, one chess game at a time. As the evening wore on, James couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. He knew what he was doing was against protocol, but every time he looked at Marcus's fragile form curled up on his couch, he knew he'd made the right choice. James sat at his kitchen table, rubbing his tired eyes. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. He was a cop, sworn to uphold the law. Yet here he was, breaking the rules he'd vowed to follow. "It's for the boy's own good," he muttered to himself, trying to ease his conscience. "The system's overwhelmed. He'd just fall through the cracks." James glanced at Marcus, who had finally drifted off to sleep. The boy's face, usually guarded and wary, looked peaceful for the first time since James had found him. It tugged at James's heart, reminding him of why he'd become a police officer in the first place, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He thought about the alternative. Marcus back on the streets or lost in a system that was too stretched thin to give him the care he needed. The thought made James's stomach churn. No, he said firmly to himself. I can't let that happen. James knew he was risking his career, his reputation, everything he'd worked for. But as he watched Marcus's chest rise and fall with each breath, he realized some things were more important than rules and regulations. He pulled out his phone, staring at it for a long moment. He should call it in, report what he'd done. But his finger hovered over the screen, unable to make the call. Instead, he set the phone down and walked over to Marcus. Gently, he tucked the blanket more securely around the sleeping boy. I've got you, kid, he whispered. You're safe now. As James settled into his armchair for the night, prepared to keep watch over his young charge, he felt a mix of emotions. Fear of discovery warred with a sense of rightness. He was breaking the rules, yes, but he was following his heart, his instinct to protect. Sometimes, James thought, doing the right thing means bending the rules a little. He just hoped that when the time came, others would understand his choice. As the first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains, James stirred from his uncomfortable position in the armchair. He blinked, momentarily confused, before his eyes landed on Marcus, still curled up on the couch. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and James felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Marcus began to stir, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, fear flashed across his face as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Then his gaze settled on James, and he visibly relaxed. "Morning, kid," James said softly. "How'd you sleep?" Marcus sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Okay, I guess," he mumbled. "Better than, you know." James nodded, understanding the unspoken comparison to the park. "Hungry?" he asked, already heading to the kitchen. As James busied himself making breakfast, he noticed Marcus looking around the living room. The boy's eyes lingered on a small bookshelf in the corner. "You can take a look if you want," James offered. Marcus hesitated, then slowly approached the shelf. He ran his fingers along the spines of the books, pausing at a worn sketchbook tucked between two novels. "You like to draw?" James asked, noticing Marcus's interest. Marcus nodded shyly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "When I can find paper and stuff." James felt a pang in his heart. He remembered the joy his wife had found in art, how it had been her escape during tough times. "Tell you what," he said. "Why don't you use that sketchbook? There should be some pencils in the drawer below." Marcus's eyes widened. "Really? You don't mind?" "Not at all," James assured him. "I'd like to see what you can do." As they ate breakfast, Marcus sketched quietly. James watched, amazed at how the boy's entire demeanor changed when he was drawing. The wariness melted away, replaced by a look of concentration and, dare he say it, contentment. "That's really good," James said, peering at the rough outline of a tree taking shape on the page. Marcus ducked his head, but James caught a hint of a smile. "It's just the old oak from the park," he mumbled. "You've got a real talent there," James encouraged. "You know, I think I might have some colored pencils somewhere. Would you like those?" Marcus nodded eagerly, his eyes lighting up. As James rummaged through a closet searching for his wife's old art supplies, he felt a warmth spreading in his chest. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. Helping Marcus, seeing the boy slowly come out of his shell, it filled a void James hadn't even realized was there. He returned with a box of colored pencils and some better quality drawing paper. Marcus's face lit up like it was Christmas morning. "These were my wife's," James explained, swallowing the lump in his throat. "She'd want them to be used by someone who appreciates them." Marcus looked up at James, a mix of gratitude and understanding in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly, and James knew he meant for more than just the art supplies. As Marcus settled in to draw, his small hand moving confidently across the paper, James felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, by helping this boy find his voice through art, James could find his own way back to life too. As the days passed, James and Marcus fell into a comfortable routine. During quiet moments, Marcus began to open up, sharing fragments of his past in hesitant whispers. "My mom," Marcus said one evening, his eyes fixed on his drawing. "She tried her best, you know?" James nodded, encouraging the boy to continue. "But sometimes—" Marcus trailed off, his pencil hovering over the paper. "Sometimes things were really hard." James felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to ask for more details, but he knew pushing too hard might make Marcus retreat back into his shell. Instead, he simply said, "I'm here if you ever want to talk about it, kid." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. As they spent more time together, James found himself naturally slipping into a mentorship role. He taught Marcus how to cook simple meals, do laundry, and even balance a checkbook. "Why do I need to know this stuff?" Marcus asked one day as James showed him how to change a light bulb. "Because," James replied, ruffling the boy's hair, "these are things every young man should know. They'll help you take care of yourself." Marcus beamed at being called a young man, standing a little taller. One sunny morning, as they walked past the abandoned park, James had an idea. "What do you say we clean this place up a bit?" he suggested. Marcus looked skeptical. "Just us?" "Why not?" James grinned. "We've got to start somewhere, right?" They began small, picking up litter and pulling weeds. As they worked, James noticed how Marcus seemed to come alive in the open air, his movements becoming more confident and purposeful. "You know," Marcus said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow, "I used to come here sometimes. Before, you know." James nodded, understanding the unspoken, "before I was alone." "It wasn't always this messy," Marcus continued. "There used to be kids playing and stuff." "Well," James said, placing a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder, "maybe we can help bring some of that back." As they worked, a few curious neighbors stopped by asking what they were doing. James explained their impromptu cleanup project, and to his surprise, a couple of people offered to help. By the end of the day, the park looked noticeably better. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As they stood back to admire their work, James felt a swell of pride, not just for the park, but for Marcus. "We did good today, kid," James said. Marcus nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Yeah," he agreed. "We did." As James and Marcus continued their efforts to clean up the park, their dedication began to catch the attention of the neighbors. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Santos, an elderly woman who lived across the street, approached them with a plate of cookies. "I've been watching you two work so hard," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I thought you might need a little pick-me-up." Marcus's eyes widened at the sight of the treats. James nodded gratefully. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Santos. Thank you." As they munched on the cookies, more neighbors started to trickle in. Mr. Rodriguez, a retired teacher, brought over some gardening tools. "Thought these might come in handy," he said with a smile. Soon, a small group had gathered, all pitching in to help. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air as they worked together, pulling weeds and planting flowers. Marcus, who had been quiet and reserved, began to open up. James watched with pride as the boy showed a group of kids how to properly plant seedlings, his face animated as he explained the process. "Look at that," Mrs. Santos said, nudging James. "That boy of yours has quite the green thumb." James felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to think of Marcus as his boy. As the days passed, the park slowly transformed. The rusty swings were repainted, the broken seesaw fixed, and colorful flowers bloomed where weeds once grew. But it wasn't just the park that was changing. James noticed Marcus smiling more often. The boy's laughter, once so rare, now rang out frequently as he played with the neighborhood kids. His drawings, too, became brighter and more hopeful. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a long day of work, Marcus turned to James. "You know," he said softly, "I never thought I'd have this again." "Have what?" James asked. Marcus gestured vaguely around them. "This. A home. People who care." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. He placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, squeezing gently. "You'll always have this, kid. I promise." As for James, he found himself smiling more too. The heavy weight of grief that had settled on his shoulders after his wife's death began to lift. He still missed her terribly, but helping Marcus, watching the boy blossom, filled him with a sense of purpose he thought he'd lost forever. The park project had sparked something in the community. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now stopped to chat on the street. The sound of children playing echoed through the once quiet neighborhood. It was as if the town itself was coming back to life, one small act of kindness at a time. As the days grew warmer and longer, James and Marcus fell into a comfortable routine. They'd spend their mornings working in the park, afternoons playing chess or drawing, and evenings sharing quiet meals at home. But despite the progress, there were moments when James sensed an underlying tension in Marcus. One afternoon, as they were planting new flowers in the park, James casually mentioned school. "You know, Marcus, we should start thinking about getting you enrolled for the fall." Marcus's body went rigid. His hands, which had been gently patting soil around a young sapling, suddenly clenched into fists. I don't want to go to school," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. James noticed the change immediately. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, trying to reassure the boy. "We don't have to decide anything right now." But Marcus remained tense, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. James felt a pang in his heart, realizing there was still so much about Marcus's past that he didn't know. Later that week, James was at the police station when his colleague, Officer Thompson, pulled him aside. "James, can we talk for a minute?" Thompson's face was etched with concern. They stepped into an empty room and Thompson closed the door. "Look, James," he began, his voice low. "I know you're trying to do right by that kid, but you're walking a dangerous line here." James felt his defenses rise. "What are you talking about?" "You can't just take in a kid off the street," Thompson explained. "There are rules, protocols. If the wrong people find out, you could lose your job. Worse, they could take Marcus away." The thought of losing Marcus made James's stomach churn. But he knew Thompson was right. He'd been so focused on helping Marcus that he hadn't fully considered the potential consequences of his actions. That night, James was jolted awake by a scream. He rushed to Marcus's room to find the boy thrashing in his bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare. "No, please, don't hurt me," Marcus cried out, his voice filled with terror. James gently shook him awake. "Marcus, it's okay. You're safe. It's just a dream." Marcus's eyes flew open, wild with fear. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize James. Then, with a sob, he threw himself into James's arms. As James held the trembling boy, he realized that there was so much more to Marcus's story than he knew. The nightmares, the anxiety about school, the fear of authority figures, all pointed to deeper, unresolved traumas. James stroked Marcus's hair, murmuring words of comfort. But inside, his mind was racing. How could he protect Marcus from the demons of his past? And how could he keep him safe from a system that might tear them apart? The following day, as James and Marcus were working in the park, a black sedan pulled up nearby. Two women in professional attire stepped out, their expressions serious as they approached. James felt a knot form in his stomach. He instinctively moved closer to Marcus, who was kneeling by a flower bed, oblivious to the newcomers. "Officer James Carter?" one of the women asked, her tone crisp and official. James nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes, that's me." "I'm Samantha Lawson from Child Protective Services, and this is my colleague, Emily Chen," she said, gesturing to the woman beside her. "We need to speak with you about Marcus." Marcus's head snapped up at the mention of his name. His eyes widened with fear as he saw the strangers. He scrambled to his feet, moving behind James as if seeking protection. "It's okay, Marcus," James said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. But inside, he was panicking. He knew this moment would come, but he wasn't prepared for it. Samantha's gaze softened as she looked at Marcus. "Hello, Marcus. We're here to help you." Marcus didn't respond. He gripped the back of James's shirt tightly, his body trembling. "Officer Carter," "We need to discuss the situation," Emily said. "Perhaps we could speak privately." James hesitated, not wanting to leave Marcus alone, but he knew he had no choice. "Marcus, why don't you keep working on the flowers? I'll be right over there talking to these ladies." Marcus shook his head vehemently. "No, don't go," he whispered, his voice filled with panic. James's heart broke at the fear in Marcus's voice. "I promise I'll be right back," he said, gently prying Marcus's fingers from his shirt. As James walked a short distance away with the CPS workers, he could feel Marcus's eyes boring into his back. The conversation that followed was tense and filled with barely concealed accusations. "Officer Carter, you've been harboring an unregistered minor for weeks," Samantha said, her tone stern. "This is a serious breach of protocol." "I was trying to protect him," James argued. "The system is overwhelmed. He would have fallen through the cracks." "That wasn't your decision to make," Emily countered. "There are procedures in place for a reason." As they talked, James glanced over at Marcus. The boy was standing exactly where James had left him, his body rigid with tension, his eyes never leaving the group. "We'll need to take Marcus into custody immediately," Samantha said, "and I'm afraid there will be disciplinary action against you, Officer Carter." James felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. "Please," he pleaded, "at least let me explain to Marcus what's happening." The women exchanged a look before nodding reluctantly. With a heavy heart, James walked back to Marcus. As he approached, he saw a mixture of hope and fear in the boy's eyes. "Marcus," James began, his voice cracking, "these people, they're here to take you somewhere safe." Marcus's face crumpled. "But I'm safe with you," he said, his voice small and broken. "I know, buddy," James said, fighting back tears, "but I didn't do things the right way. I should have told someone about you sooner." As understanding dawned on Marcus's face, James saw the trust they had built over the past weeks shatter. Marcus took a step back, his expression hardening. "You promised," Marcus whispered, his voice filled with betrayal. "You promised you wouldn't send me away." Before James could respond, Marcus turned and ran towards the park's exit. Sarah and Emily quickly followed, calling out to him. James stood rooted to the spot, watching helplessly as Marcus disappeared from view. The progress they had made, the trust they had built, all seemed to crumble in an instant, and James was left alone in the park, surrounded by the flowers they had planted together, feeling the weight of his good intentions turn to ashes. James sat on the park bench, his head in his hands. The once peaceful garden now felt like a mockery of his good intentions. The flowers he and Marcus had planted together swayed in the breeze, oblivious to the pain that hung in the air. "What have I done?" James whispered to himself, his voice thick with regret. He replayed the scene in his mind over and over again. The look of betrayal in Marcus's eyes haunted him. James had promised to protect the boy, to be there for him, and now he felt like he had failed spectacularly. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, James's thoughts turned to his career. He had always prided himself on being a good officer, someone who followed the rules and upheld the law. But now those very rules felt like shackles, preventing him from doing what he believed was right. "How can I continue to wear this badge?" he wondered aloud, fingering the metal pinned to his chest. The weight of it seemed heavier than ever before. James thought about all the times he had turned a blind eye to the flaws in the system, convincing himself that following protocol was always the best course of action. But Marcus had changed everything. The boy's vulnerability and need for protection had awakened something in James, a fierce desire to do what was morally right, even if it meant bending the rules. As night fell, James found himself driving aimlessly through the town. He passed by his empty house, unable to bear the thought of going inside. The silence would be too much to handle. Instead, he kept driving, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. He thought about Marcus, wondering where the boy was now. Was he safe? Was he scared? The image of Marcus running away, his small figure disappearing into the distance, played on repeat in James's mind. "I should have done more," James muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I should have fought harder for him." But even as he said it, James knew the reality of the situation. He was just one man, up against a system that was bigger than him. A system that, until now, he had been a part of without question. As he drove past the police station, James felt a surge of doubt. Could he really go back there, put on his uniform, and pretend that nothing had changed? The thought made his stomach churn. For the first time in his career, James found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about right and wrong, about duty and morality. The lines that had once seemed so clear were now blurred beyond recognition. As the night wore on, James felt more alone than he had since losing his wife. The connection he had formed with Marcus, the sense of purpose he had found in caring for the boy, had been a lifeline. Now, that lifeline was gone, leaving James adrift in a sea of uncertainty and regret. As dawn broke over the small town, James found himself once again at the park. He sat on the same bench, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his worries. But this morning, something was different. A familiar voice called out, "Officer Carter? Got a minute?" James looked up to see Mrs. Santos, his next-door neighbor, approaching with a determined look on her face. Behind her, a small group of people followed. "What's this about?" James asked, his voice tired and wary. Mrs. Santos' eyes softened. "We heard what happened with Marcus. We're here to help." James blinked in surprise as he took in the faces around him. There was Mr. Davis from the hardware store, a few of his fellow officers, and even the grumpy old man who lived on the corner. Mr. Davis stepped forward. "We saw how you and that boy breathed life back into this park. It wasn't just about cleaning up trash. You gave us all hope." "But I broke the rules," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. One of his colleagues, Officer Johnson, shook his head. "Sometimes doing the right thing means coloring outside the lines a bit. We've got your back, James." As James struggled to find words, a woman he didn't recognize stepped forward. She extended her hand, introducing herself as Martha Martinez. "I'm a lawyer," she said, her eyes kind but determined. "I'd like to offer my services pro bono to help you and Marcus." James felt a lump form in his throat. "Why would you do that?" Martha smiled. "Because sometimes the system needs a little push to do what's right. And from what I've heard, you and Marcus deserve that chance." Just then, Officer Johnson's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then looked up at James with a grin. "Speaking of Marcus, there's something waiting for you at the station." Curious and a bit apprehensive, James made his way to the police station. On his desk, he found an envelope. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside was a drawing. It showed two figures, a tall one and a small one, standing in front of a colorful park. The sun shone brightly overhead, and at the bottom, in childish scrawl, were the words, "Thank you for believing in me." James felt tears prick his eyes. The drawing was a lifeline, a sign that all wasn't lost. Marcus still trusted him, still believed in him. As he looked at the drawing, James felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. With the community behind him, a lawyer willing to fight for them, and this small gesture from Marcus, maybe, just maybe, things weren't as bleak as they had seemed. With renewed determination, James sat across from Martha Martinez in her modest law office. The walls were lined with books, and a small potted plant on her desk added a touch of life to the room. "We need to fight for Marcus," James said, his voice firm. "He deserves a safe home, and I want to make sure he gets it." Martha nodded, her eyes serious. "I agree. Let's start by digging into his background. We need to know everything we can to build a strong case." Over the next few days, James and Martha worked tirelessly. They pored over records, made phone calls, and followed every lead they could find about Marcus's past. One afternoon, as James was sifting through a stack of papers, his eyes widened. "Martha, look at this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha leaned over, her brow furrowed as she read the document. It was a death certificate, dated just 3 months ago. "Marcus's mother," James said softly. "She passed away recently." Martha's face softened with sympathy. Poor boy, no wonder he was on his own. As they dug deeper, a sad picture began to emerge. Marcus's mother had been his only family, struggling to make ends meet in a nearby city. There were no records of any other relatives. "He's all alone," James said, his heart heavy. No wonder he was so scared and mistrustful. Martha placed a comforting hand on James's shoulder. "This changes things. With no known relatives, we have a stronger case for your guardianship, or at least ensuring he's placed in a safe foster home." James nodded, feeling a mix of sadness for Marcus's loss and hope for his future. "We need to make sure he knows he's not alone anymore, that he has people fighting for him." As they continued their investigation, James couldn't help but think of the drawing Marcus had sent him. The boy had thanked him for believing in him. Now, armed with this new information, James was more determined than ever to prove that belief wasn't misplaced. The courtroom buzzed with tension as James Carter stood before the judge, his heart pounding. Martha Martinez, his lawyer, stood confidently by his side. Across the aisle, representatives from Child Protective Services, CPS, watched with stern expressions. "Your Honor," Martha began, her voice clear and strong, "Officer Carter has shown exceptional care and commitment to Marcus's well-being. We believe granting him temporary guardianship is in the child's best interest." The CPS lawyer countered, his tone sharp. "While we appreciate Officer Carter's concern, we cannot overlook his initial breach of protocol. It sets a dangerous precedent." James felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew his actions, though well-intentioned, had complicated matters. As the arguments continued, his mind drifted to his last conversation with Marcus. Just yesterday, he had visited the boy at the group home where he was temporarily staying. Marcus had been withdrawn, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "James," Marcus had whispered, his voice trembling, "I don't want to go into foster care. What if they're mean like my dad was?" James's heart had ached at the fear in Marcus's voice. "I'm doing everything I can to make sure you're safe," he had promised, wishing he could do more to ease the boy's anxiety. Now, standing in the courtroom, James felt the weight of that promise. He listened intently as Martha argued passionately for his case, highlighting the positive changes in Marcus's behavior and the community support they had garnered. The CPS lawyer, however, remained skeptical. "Officer Carter's intentions may be good, but his judgment is questionable. We need to ensure Marcus is placed in a stable environment with experienced caregivers." As the hearing progressed, James couldn't help but think of Marcus, alone and scared in the group home. The boy's fear of the foster system weighed heavily on him, adding to the emotional complexity of the situation. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood tall, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Your Honor, I know I made mistakes in how I initially handled Marcus's case, but I've seen the difference a stable, caring environment can make for him. He's starting to trust again, to hope again. I'm asking for the chance to continue helping him heal and grow." The judge listened attentively, her expression unreadable. As James sat down, he felt a mix of hope and anxiety. He knew that whatever the outcome, Marcus's future hung in the balance. As the courtroom proceedings continued, a startling revelation sent shockwaves through the room. The CPS lawyer cleared his throat, his expression grave. "Your Honor, we've uncovered new information," he announced. "Marcus's father, Daniel Thompson, is alive and currently serving time in the state penitentiary." A collective gasp filled the room. James felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He glanced at Martha, who looked equally stunned. The judge leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "And what is the nature of Mr. Thompson's incarceration?" "He's serving a 5-year sentence for aggravated assault, Your Honor," the CPS lawyer replied. "He's eligible for parole in 6 months." James's mind raced. He remembered Marcus's fearful words about his father. The pieces started to fall into place. The boy's nightmares, his anxiety around certain topics. It all made sense now. The judge turned to James and Martha. "This certainly complicates matters. Mr. Thompson retains parental rights unless deemed unfit. We'll need to investigate further before making any decisions about Marcus's guardianship." Outside the courtroom, James paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. Martha watched him with concern. "James, we need to talk to Marcus," she said gently. "He needs to know about his father." James nodded, his heart heavy. He dreaded having to break this news to the boy who had already been through so much. Later that day, James sat across from Marcus in a small meeting room at the group home. The boy's eyes were wide with confusion and fear. My dad?" Marcus stammered. "But I don't want to be with him." James leaned forward, his voice soft. "I know this is a shock, Marcus. We just found out ourselves. Your dad is in prison, but he might get out soon." Marcus's hands trembled as he picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "What does this mean? Do I have to go live with him?" "We don't know yet," James answered honestly. "The judge will have to decide what's best for you." Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes. "But I don't want to go with him. I want to stay with you, James." James's heart ached. He wanted nothing more than to promise Marcus that everything would be okay, but he knew he couldn't make guarantees. "I'm fighting for you, Marcus," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." As Marcus wiped his eyes, James could see the internal struggle playing out on the boy's face. Marcus was torn between the fear of the unknown and the faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, his father had changed. What if he's different now?" Marcus asked hesitantly. "What if he's sorry?" James took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know, Marcus. People can change, but it's okay to be cautious. We'll take this one step at a time, okay?" Marcus nodded, his eyes filled with uncertainty. The revelation of his father's existence had thrown everything into chaos, leaving both James and Marcus navigating a sea of conflicting emotions and possibilities. As the days passed, the weight of uncertainty hung heavy over James and Marcus. The courtroom became a battlefield of emotions, with each hearing bringing new challenges and disappointments. On a crisp autumn morning, James sat in the back of the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly together. He watched as the judge listened to the arguments from both sides, her face a mask of neutrality. Marcus sat beside his court-appointed guardian, his small frame hunched and eyes fixed on the floor. "Given the complexity of this case," the judge began, her voice echoing in the silent room, "I'm inclined to place Marcus in a group home while we await further information about his father's situation." James felt his heart sink. He glanced at Marcus, who seemed to shrink even further into himself at the judge's words. Outside the courtroom, James approached Marcus, hoping to offer some comfort. But the boy's eyes were distant, his face a blank slate. "Marcus," James said softly, kneeling down to meet the boy's gaze. "I know this isn't what we hoped for, but we're not giving up. We'll keep fighting." Marcus didn't respond. He simply stared past James as if he wasn't there at all. The light that had slowly been returning to the boy's eyes over the past weeks seemed to have been extinguished. In the days that followed, James visited Marcus at the group home as often as he could. Each time, he found the boy more withdrawn, barely speaking or acknowledging James's presence. One afternoon, James sat across from Marcus in the home's visiting area. The room was filled with the chatter of other families, but between them, silence reigned. "I brought your sketchbook," James said, sliding the familiar notebook across the table. "Thought you might want to draw something." Marcus glanced at the book, then back at his hands folded in his lap. "What's the point?" he mumbled, his voice barely audible. James felt a lump form in his throat. "Marcus, I know things look bleak right now, but..." "But what?" Marcus interrupted, a spark of anger flashing in his eyes. "Nothing's going to change. I'll just end up back with my dad or stuck here forever. There's no hope for anything good to happen." The bitterness in the boy's voice cut James to the core. He wanted to argue, to reassure Marcus that things would get better, but the words caught in his throat. The truth was, he was beginning to lose hope himself. As James left the group home that day, he felt a deep sense of despair settling over him. He had promised Marcus he would fight for him, but now it seemed like all their efforts had been in vain. The system that was supposed to protect children like Marcus seemed determined to let him down. As James drove home from the group home, his mind raced with worry for Marcus. The boy's hopelessness weighed heavily on his heart. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial, some piece of the puzzle that could help them both. When he arrived home, James noticed a small box on his porch. Puzzled, he picked it up and read the note attached. Officer Carter, these are Marcus's remaining belongings from the park. We thought you might want to keep them safe. Child Services. James carried the box inside, his hands trembling slightly. He set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long moment before slowly opening the lid. Inside were a few tattered clothes, some worn-out shoes, and a small, battered backpack. As James carefully emptied the backpack, something fluttered to the floor. He bent down to pick it up and realized it was an envelope, yellowed with age and crumpled from being hidden away. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the name scrawled across the front, Marcus. With shaking hands, James opened the envelope and pulled out several folded sheets of paper. As he began to read, his eyes widened in shock. "My dearest Marcus," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I'm so sorry, my sweet boy. There's so much I need to tell you, so much you need to understand." James sank into a chair, his legs suddenly weak. The letter was from Marcus's mother, and as he read on, the truth of Marcus's past unfolded before him. "I've done everything I can to keep you safe from your father," the letter continued. "The abuse we suffered at his hands. I couldn't let that happen to you again. That's why we left, why we've been running for so long. I know you don't remember much of it, and I'm grateful for that. But I need you to know that you must never go back to him. No matter what anyone says, no matter what the courts might decide, you cannot be with him. He hasn't changed, Marcus. He'll never change." Tears welled up in James's eyes as he read the pain and fear in every word. Suddenly, Marcus's deep-seated anxiety, his nightmares, his reluctance to talk about his past, it all made sense. James read through the rest of the letters, each one revealing more about the abuse Marcus and his mother had endured, and her desperate attempts to protect her son. The final letter contained a plea that struck James to his core. "If anything happens to me, I pray that someone kind and good will look after you, Marcus. Someone who will protect you the way I've tried to. Someone who will love you and keep you safe from the monsters of your past." As James finished reading, a fierce determination welled up inside him. He understood now with crystal clarity why Marcus was so afraid, why the prospect of being reunited with his father had shut him down completely. "I won't let you down, Marcus," James whispered, clutching the letters to his chest. "I won't let your mother down. I promise you, I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." With renewed purpose, James reached for his phone. He had calls to make, people to see. These letters changed everything, and he was going to make sure they were heard in court. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. With the weight of Marcus's mother's letters heavy in his hands, James sprang into action. He called his lawyer, his voice urgent and filled with newfound determination. "We've got new evidence," James said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Letters from Marcus's mother. They change everything." The next morning, James met with his lawyer at her office. As he handed over the letters, he watched her face change from curiosity to shock, then to fierce resolve. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, her eyes scanning the pages. "These letters prove the father's history of abuse. We can use this to show he's unfit for custody." James nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "What's our next step?" "We need to gather more evidence," the lawyer replied. "Witness statements, police reports, anything that corroborates what's in these letters." Over the next few days, James threw himself into the task. He reached out to former neighbors, tracked down old police reports, and even managed to find Marcus's mother's old therapist, who agreed to testify about the abuse she had counseled her through. As word spread about their efforts, the community's support grew stronger. People who had seen James and Marcus working in the park, who had witnessed the positive change in both of them, rallied to their cause. Petitions circulated through the town, gathering hundreds of signatures. Letters of support poured in from neighbors, teachers, and even some of James's fellow officers who had seen his dedication to Marcus. One evening, as James sorted through the pile of support letters, he felt a lump form in his throat. The outpouring of love and concern for Marcus was overwhelming. He picked up one letter, written in a child's messy scrawl. "Marcus is my friend. He helped me when some big kids were being mean. He's good and nice, and should stay with Officer Carter because Officer Carter makes him happy. James blinked back tears, his resolve strengthening. He couldn't let Marcus down, not when so many people believed in them. The lawyer called, her voice excited. "James, we've got something big. I found a former cellmate of Marcus's father who's willing to testify. He says the father bragged about how he used to keep his family in line. This could be the nail in the coffin for his custody claim." James felt a mix of relief and anger wash over him. "That's great news," he said, his voice tight. "We can't let that man anywhere near Marcus." As the court date approached, James's determination only grew stronger. He visited Marcus at the group home as often as he could, reassuring the boy that he was doing everything in his power to keep him safe. "I promise you, Marcus," James said softly one day, as they sat playing chess, "I won't let anyone hurt you ever again. We're going to get through this together." Marcus looked up, a small smile on his face. For the first time in days, James saw a spark of hope in the boy's eyes. It was all the motivation he needed to keep fighting, no matter what challenges lay ahead. As the court date loomed closer, James and his lawyer worked tirelessly to prepare their case. They spent long hours poring over documents, organizing evidence, and rehearsing their arguments. The weight of Marcus's future hung heavy on James's shoulders, but he refused to let it crush him. "We need to focus on what's best for Marcus," James said, his voice firm as he sat across from his lawyer in her cluttered office. She nodded, shuffling through a stack of papers. "Absolutely. We have strong evidence showing the father's history of abuse. The community support is overwhelming, but—" She paused, her eyes meeting James's. "Having Marcus speak could make a huge difference." James felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew how difficult it would be for Marcus to talk about his past, but he also understood how powerful the boy's testimony could be. The next day, James visited Marcus at the group home. They sat in the small visiting room, the air thick with unspoken worries. "Marcus," James began gently, "we think it might help if you speak in court. Tell the judge about your experiences, your fears." He watched the boy's face carefully, seeing the flicker of panic in his eyes. Marcus looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, James. What if they don't believe me?" James's heart ached. He reached out, placing a comforting hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I know it's scary, buddy, but remember, you're not alone. I'll be there, and so will a lot of people who care about you." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears, but also determination. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll do it." Over the next few days, James and the lawyer worked with Marcus, helping him prepare for what he might face in court. They practiced breathing exercises to keep him calm and went over the questions he might be asked. As the final hearing approached, the tension in the air was palpable. James found himself pacing in his living room late at night, his mind racing with all the possible outcomes. He picked up a framed photo of himself and Marcus taken during one of their days working in the park. The boy's smile in the picture gave James a renewed sense of purpose. "We're going to get through this," he whispered to the photograph. "No matter what." The night before the hearing, James couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his thoughts a whirlwind of worry and hope. As dawn broke, he got up, made a cup of coffee, and sat on his porch, watching the sun rise over the town. In just a few hours, they would be in court fighting for Marcus's future. James took a deep breath, steeling himself for the emotional battle ahead. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but with Marcus's bravery, the community's support, and the strength of their case, he dared to hope for a positive outcome. The courtroom was filled with a palpable tension as James, Marcus, and their lawyer took their seats. James's heart raced, but he kept a calm exterior for Marcus's sake. The boy sat beside him, fidgeting nervously with the sleeve of his new shirt. As the hearing began, James's lawyer presented their case with precision and passion. She outlined the evidence of Marcus's father's abusive past, including police reports and testimonies from neighbors. She then shifted focus to James's positive influence on Marcus, presenting letters from community members and even a few of Marcus's teachers who had noticed a remarkable improvement in the boy's demeanor and academic performance. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, her voice clear and strong, "Officer Carter has provided Marcus with stability, safety, and love. Things this child desperately needed and deserved." James watched the judge's face carefully, trying to gauge her reaction. Her expression remained neutral, but he thought he saw a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. Next came the most challenging part of the hearing. Marcus was called to testify. James gave the boy's shoulder a gentle squeeze as he stood up, his small frame looking even tinier as he approached the witness stand. Marcus's voice trembled as he began to speak, but with each word, he seemed to grow stronger. He talked about his life before meeting James, the fear, the loneliness, the constant uncertainty. Then, his voice softened as he described how things had changed. "Officer Carter, James. He made me feel safe for the first time in forever," Marcus said, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "He taught me chess and bought me art supplies. He listens to me, and he cares." The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word. James felt a lump form in his throat as he watched Marcus bravely share his story. "I don't want to go back to my dad," Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "He hurt me. He scared me. But James, he's like the dad I always wished I had." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom as Marcus finished speaking. Even the judge seemed visibly moved, taking a moment to compose herself before thanking Marcus for his bravery. As Marcus returned to his seat, James gave him a proud smile, fighting back his own tears. The boy had shown incredible courage, and James felt a surge of protective love wash over him. The judge's expression was thoughtful as she listened to the final arguments. It was clear she was wrestling with the weight of her decision, balancing the legal obligations with the heartfelt pleas she had just heard. James held his breath, knowing that the next few moments would determine not just his future, but Marcus's as well. The courtroom fell silent as the judge cleared her throat, ready to deliver her verdict. James's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel Marcus trembling beside him. The boy's small hand found its way into James's, and he gave it a reassuring squeeze. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, the judge began, her voice steady and clear. "I have come to a decision in this case." She paused, looking directly at James and Marcus. "It is clear to this court that the bond between Officer James Carter and Marcus is not only strong but also deeply beneficial to the child's well-being. Officer Carter has demonstrated exceptional dedication to Marcus's care and safety, going above and beyond what is expected." James felt a glimmer of hope rising in his chest, but he dared not let it show just yet. The judge continued, "Furthermore, the evidence of neglect and abuse by Marcus's biological father is overwhelming and deeply troubling. It is the opinion of this court that returning Marcus to such an environment would be detrimental to his physical and emotional health." She took a deep breath before delivering her final ruling. "Therefore, I am granting legal guardianship of Marcus to James Carter. Additionally, I am recommending the termination of the biological father's parental rights due to the documented history of neglect and abuse." The words hung in the air for a moment before their full meaning sank in. James felt as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. He turned to Marcus, whose eyes were wide with disbelief and hope. "We did it," James whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're staying with me, buddy." Marcus's face crumpled and he threw himself into James's arms. James held him tightly, feeling the boy's tears soaking into his shirt. His own eyes welled up as the enormity of the moment washed over him. "Thank you," Marcus sobbed, his words muffled against James's chest. "Thank you for not giving up on me." James stroked Marcus's hair gently, his heart overflowing with love and relief. "I never will, Marcus. I promise." The courtroom erupted in applause, the community members who had come to support them sharing in their joy. James looked up to see tears in the eyes of their lawyer, who gave him a triumphant smile and a thumbs up. As the judge called for order, James and Marcus reluctantly pulled apart, wiping their eyes. But they kept their hands clasped tightly together, a physical representation of the unbreakable bond that had just been legally recognized. As the dust settled from the courtroom victory, James and Marcus began their journey as a legally recognized family. The adoption process, while lengthy, was filled with moments of joy and anticipation. James worked tirelessly to ensure every I was dotted and every T crossed, determined to give Marcus the stability he so desperately needed. On a bright spring morning, they stood before a judge once again, this time with smiles on their faces. The judge's words rang out clear and strong. "I hereby declare Marcus to be the legal son of James Carter." The gavel's sound echoed through the courtroom, sealing their bond not just in their hearts, but in the eyes of the law. Marcus's eyes shone with unshed tears as he hugged James tightly. "Dad," he whispered, testing out the word for the first time. James felt his heart swell with love and pride. "That's right, son," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We're a family now, forever and always." As they settled into their new life together, both James and Marcus found themselves healing from their past traumas. For Marcus, the nightmares that had once plagued him began to fade. He felt safe and loved, no longer fearing abandonment or abuse. His art, once a refuge from pain, became a joyful expression of his new life. James, too, found healing in his role as a father. The grief that had consumed him after his wife's death began to soften. He discovered a new purpose in raising Marcus, and the love he felt for the boy filled the emptiness in his heart. While he would always miss his wife, he knew she would be proud of the family he had created. Their healing journey wasn't always easy. There were tough days when old fears resurfaced, and patience was tested. But they faced each challenge together, growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. As James and Marcus healed, they turned their attention outward to their community. James recommitted to his role as a police officer with a renewed sense of purpose. He understood now, more than ever, the importance of compassion and going the extra mile for those in need. Together, James and Marcus continued their efforts to revitalize the town park. What had started as a small project blossomed into a community-wide initiative. Neighbors came together on weekends to plant flowers, repair playground equipment, and create a space where families could gather and children could play safely. James found himself becoming a mentor to other officers, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to look beyond the surface when dealing with troubled youth. His story with Marcus inspired a new outreach program within the police department aimed at supporting vulnerable children in the community. The sun shone brightly on the day of Hope Park's grand reopening. Colorful balloons bobbed in the gentle breeze, and the air buzzed with excitement. James and Marcus stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. The once-abandoned park had been transformed into a vibrant community space, with freshly painted playground equipment, newly planted flower beds, and clean, inviting pathways. Mayor Harrison stepped up to the podium, her face beaming with pride. "Today, we celebrate not just the reopening of a park, but the rebirth of our community spirit," she announced. "This park, which we've renamed Hope Park, stands as a testament to what we can achieve when we come together." As the crowd applauded, James felt a tug on his sleeve. He looked down to see Marcus grinning up at him. "We did it, Dad," the boy said softly. James wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders. "We sure did, buddy. We sure did." The mayor continued, "I'd like to give special recognition to Officer James Carter and his son Marcus. Their initial efforts to clean up this park sparked a movement that brought our entire town together." Cheers erupted from the crowd, and James felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment and pride. He hadn't expected this level of recognition, but he was touched by the community's support. As the ribbon-cutting ceremony concluded, families began to explore the revitalized park. Children's laughter filled the air as they climbed on the new playground equipment and chased each other across the fresh grass. Chief Williams of the police department approached James, a warm smile on his face. "Carter, your dedication to this community has inspired us all," he said. "We've decided to launch new outreach programs to build stronger relationships between our officers and the people we serve." James listened intently as the chief outlined plans for youth mentorship programs, community forums, and collaborative projects similar to the park restoration. We want to foster trust and engagement, Chief Williams explained. Your story with Marcus showed us the power of going beyond the call of duty. As the celebration continued, James watched Marcus playing chess with some of the local kids at one of the new picnic tables. The sight filled him with joy and a sense of accomplishment. They had not only found healing in each other, but had also helped bring healing to their entire community. As the celebration in Hope Park continued, James and Marcus made their way to a quiet corner where a small sapling waited to be planted. The tree, a young oak, stood as a symbol of new beginnings and growth. James handed Marcus a shovel, and together they began to dig. "You know, Marcus," James said, wiping sweat from his brow, "this tree is kind of like us. It's starting small, but with care and love, it'll grow strong and tall." Marcus nodded, his face serious as he concentrated on the task. "And it'll be here for a long time, right? Like we will be?" James felt his heart swell with emotion. "That's right, buddy. We're here to stay." As they carefully placed the sapling in the hole and began to cover its roots with soil, a small crowd gathered to watch. Among them was Mrs. Santos, an elderly neighbor who had been one of the first to join their park cleanup efforts. "Look at that," Mrs. Santos said, her eyes misty. "Who would have thought that a police officer and a young boy could bring so much change to our town?" James overheard her words and smiled. He hadn't set out to be an inspiration, but somehow, their story had touched the hearts of many in the community. As they patted down the last of the soil around the tree, Marcus stood back to admire their work. "Do you think it'll be okay?" he asked, a hint of worry in his voice. James put his arm around his son's shoulders. "With all of us looking out for it, I'm sure it will be. Just like how the community looked out for us when we needed it most." Their simple act of planting a tree had drawn more attention than James expected. He saw Chief Williams approaching with a group of young officers. "Carter," the chief called out, "would you mind sharing a few words with our new recruits? Your story has become quite the inspiration around here." James hesitated for a moment, then nodded. As he spoke to the young officers about community engagement and the importance of going beyond the call of duty, he realized how much his own perspective had changed. "Sometimes," he said, looking at Marcus, who was now showing some other kids how to water the newly planted tree, "the smallest act of kindness can change everything. It can change a life, a community, and even yourself." As the sun began to set on Hope Park, casting a warm glow over the gathered families and friends, James reflected on the journey that had brought him and Marcus to this moment. What had started as a simple act of compassion had blossomed into something far greater than he could have imagined. The once abandoned park now buzzed with life and laughter, a testament to the power of community and the transformative nature of love. James watched as Marcus, now smiling and at ease, played with his new friends. He realized that in trying to save Marcus, he had saved himself too, finding purpose and joy once again. If you enjoyed the story of Officer James and Marcus, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.